So even though this book is boring, it's pretty much for those not in academia. The APA manual essentially gives guidelines for academic writing. So it shows us academics how we should do things like margins, font, line spacing, so kind of the logistical part of writing. It just shows like all these guidelines. They just came out with the 7th edition, I believe, this year. So it's hard to like quote read it because it really just gives a lot of like here it talks about like grammar, dangling modifiers, which is just like super nerdy and academic stuff. Parentheses, I mean, but so this week I'm assigned to read chapter 5. Oops, let me find it. Here it is. So a couple of different chapters, but one of the chapters I was assigned to read was about writing and grammar, and then the other one was bias-free language guidelines. And I think out of the entire text, this is the part that is most impactful and needed. And the reason is because where you decide to put a parentheses or not put a parentheses is not going to personally offend anyone or cause further discrimination, whereas the language that we use will and does. So I really enjoyed this chapter. Also, I'm gonna be honest, I mostly skimmed it because really like a lot of this is like what I would consider common sense, but I think for a lot of people it is necessary reading. So it talks about like reducing bias, general guidelines, labels, like just using labels, acknowledging people's humanity. So some of the things that I liked is that it talks about age. As we know, ageism is a huge issue. So it talks about like specifically like how to identify people 18 and older. And then it also talks about older adults. So doing away with the terms like elderly, can include negative connotations. So instead referring to them as older adults. I liked that piece. Also, the piece about disability, I think, is something that at least I don't see being discussed a lot, but how we need to really talk about it in terms of how we frame it and using like people first mentality. So instead of saying deaf, we would say people with hearing loss or people who are deaf. Instead of saying hard of hearing, hearing impaired. So like this, like a person with a paraplegia or youth with epilepsy rather than a paraplegic or an epileptic. So I know some of this language is also being encouraged, for example, when referring to those without stable housing, instead of saying homeless, we say those with unstable house, or I forget, there's another term that I always forget, but so just kind of using person first language is what they call it, which I think is really great also. And then let's see, so same thing with negative and condescending terminology. So instead saying AIDS victim or brain damage, saying person with AIDS or person with traumatic brain injury. Again, like I feel like a lot of this is very like duh, but for some people, unfortunately, it's not. They have a whole section on gender, which is really great also, and why it's important to appropriately address gender, difference between gender versus sex. So this is really great. The other area that I really liked, terms that imply binaries. Okay, that's great. Racial and ethnic identity. So this section I really appreciate as well. They talk about the spelling and capitalization. They also talk about terms for specific groups. So African origin, Asian origin, European white. Hello. When writing about people of European ancestry, the terms white and European American are acceptable. I think a lot of Karens, let's just be honest, think that white is derogatory if we refer to someone as white. It's absolutely not. And then indigenous people around the world, and they kind of go in by country or continent, which I really appreciate. They, of course, have a whole section on Hispanic or Latinx. They talk about, I wish they would have done more to talk about why Hispanic. I'm in the group that I don't identify as Hispanic. I identify as Latina, as part of the Latinx community, but Hispanic being a term that we did not choose, but that was placed on us, and why that's problematic. They don't talk about that, but they do go into the Latinx, Latina. I haven't seen that much, to be honest. Parallel comparisons amongst groups. I really appreciate this section, writing about minorities. This is something that actually came up last night in class, because one of my classmates used a term. What did she say? I want to say she even used the term minority, and I asked her to we were doing like peer criticism or peer review, I guess, and I asked her, like, why do you use the term minority? And I let her know that I prefer the term people of color. Because minorities, and it says here, the use of minority may be viewed pejoratively because it is usually equated with being less than, oppressed, or deficient in comparison with the majority, i.e. white people. So I think that's really important to talk about. We might be a minority group, population subgroup. So where like Latinx are a minority group in academia is an appropriate way to say it, but to just refer to Latinx and minorities interchangeably is incorrect. So I did like this. Again, they talk about sexual orientation, which is another great topic. They go into like LGBTQIA and LGBTQIA plus. So I think they did a really good job here. The other section that I really liked was the socioeconomic status. And they talked about pejorative or stereotyping terms. So inner city, ghetto, the projects. Like, I don't know who is using these terms in academic writing, but for the love of God, stop. And then the last section was really great. So it talks about intersectionality, and I want to just focus in on how they define it. So intersectionality is a paradigm that addresses the multiple dimensions of identity and social systems as they intersect with one another and relate to inequalities such as racism, genderism, heterosexism, ageism, classism, among other variables. So I thought that was a really great term. Intersectionality is a word that we are using a lot, but I guess for those, I always kind of bring it back, for those not in academia, it's important to just kind of talk about it and what it means, and really allow people to not be afraid to ask. So anyways, yeah, this was chapter 5. The APA manual is available online for free. I got the hard copy because I want to be able to flip through and refer to it, but it's available online for free. If you want to read this chapter and you don't own the manual or have a copy, let me know. I will send you the link for the free copy. But yeah, I thought this chapter was great. So thank you for listening to my rant about, or my criticism, I guess, maybe, of chapter 5 of the APA manual. Didn't think I would ever have that kind of long conversation. But one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about, as I'm reviewing this is a book that I'll be using throughout my academic career and beyond, to be honest, because it is a standard that academia uses, is how things like this make academia less inclusive and less accessible. So, my dad and I were talking the other day about who deserves to be published, right? And technically there's no requirement. Like, you don't have to have a doctorate to be published, in an academic or scholarly article. My dad's like, so I can be published? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Like, if you did the research, it was accepted by whatever journal, like, yeah, you could be published. But there are so many things that are barriers to this, and quite frankly cause a lot of, they just really discourage people, I feel like. And I've referred to about like the Ivory Tower. Not So Ivory Tower is a page that I recommend you follow, and they talk a lot about like the structures that keep academia in this like elite space that then becomes unattainable or uncomfortable for people to enter. So I just want to make sure that we are aware of that. Like, as much as this has to become like, I have to know this and this is information I'm going to refer to, how doing that and the way that I use it will continue to make academia less inclusive. So I guess that's really what I'm trying to say. But anyways, if you have any thoughts about this, I'd love to hear it. It's like, I get like super nerdy academic stuff, but I find it very interesting. Feel free to comment or DM. I think this is something that I'll continue to kind of talk about. So yeah.